So now it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter for today. Jennifer D. Klein is a product of experimental project-based education herself, and she lives and breathes the student-centered pedagogies used to educate her. She became a teacher during graduate school in 1990, quickly finding the intersection between her love of writing and her fascination with educational transformation and its potential impact on social change. A former head of school with extensive international experience and over 30 years in education, including 19 in the classroom, Jennifer facilitates dynamic interactive keynotes and workshops for teachers, leaders and learners, and working to amplify the student voice to provide tools for high quality, project based learning and identity responsive teaching in all cultural and social economic contexts, and to shift school culture to support such practices. Motivated by her belief that all children deserve a meaningful, relevant education like the one she experienced herself, and that giving them such an education will catalyze positive change in their communities and beyond. Jennifer strives to inspire educators to shift their practices in schools worldwide. So, Jennifer,
Yes.
I am going to hand this over to you.
Excellent. Well, let me start sharing my slides. First of all, thank you to everyone for being here. This is my first public webinar for this book, and I'm really excited to be here and have the opportunity to talk to everyone. I want to make sure that I open the chat because there are a couple of moments where I'm going to ask all of you to jump in and share something, some thoughts, some ideas, and so I want to make sure that I can see that. So today we're going to be talking about this new book, this project. It's been quite the journey. I'll start by saying that I originally thought I was going to write this book all by myself, meaning that I thought that my own storyline was going to be enough. As a former head of school, I led a school outside of Bogota in Colombia for 3 years, and was charged with a very challenging task, which was to bring project-based and student-centered learning and truly student-directed learning into a cultural context where parents were just terrified it was a waste of time and that their kids wouldn't get into university. It's probably something that some of you have heard before too. So I experienced a lot of this myself, but this book really started to take form at the moment that I realized that my story was not enough for this book. And I started interviewing leaders around the world. So in the end, I ended up with 67 global leaders, either inside schoolhouses and districts, or educational thought leaders in other senses of the word, and really, ended up with a very powerful combination community, I would say, even of educators from all over who believed in these ideas and were willing to share what was challenging for them, what were the kinds of initiatives that they were taking on that they knew mattered for learners, what was the resistance that they were getting and why. And what were the strategies they were using to handle that polarization or turbulence as they went through their careers. So the book, I hope, is an opportunity for solidarity, but also a practical opportunity for anyone in this room, in this space, in this conversation, and anyone seeing this video after the fact who is facing some resistance to things that you know perfectly well are important and good for learners. So I'm going to start with the opening epigraph, actually, of the book, and it comes from Viktor Frankl, "What gives light must endure burning." This theme came up over and over again in the interviews with these leaders, that they're sort of consistent recognition that to be able to be a light bearer or to be somebody who brings light and good things into children's lives and teachers' lives and families' lives, you have to be prepared for some difficult times as well. And that question came up over and over. How do we make sure that we can maintain that light and not just burnout. That came up pretty repeatedly. So to frame the resistance, and I apologize, there are a couple slides in here with more words than I should probably have on them, but this one, I wouldn't want to cut it back either. This is from a talk to teachers that James Baldwin gave in 1963. And I think it's painfully relevant still today in the United States, but also beyond our shores as well. It really is all over the place that these things are happening. So what Baldwin wrote was, let's begin by saying, or said, I should say, it's a talk. Let's begin by saying that we are living through a very dangerous time. To any citizen of this country who figures himself as responsible, and particularly those of you who deal with the minds and hearts of young people, must be prepared to go for broke. Or to put it another way, you must understand that in the attempt to correct so many generations of bad faith and cruelty, when it is operating not only in the classroom but in society, you will meet the most fantastic, the most brutal, and the most determined resistance. There is no point in pretending that this won't happen. I appreciate this statement, particularly for that last line. There is no point in pretending this won't happen. It is happening. It has happened in the past. It will happen in the future. That people will question what educators believe to be important for their learners, and will question leaders' choices. It's a particularly challenging time right now in terms of the polarization of views, but I think what James Baldwin said is absolutely true, that we have to be prepared to go for broke. And this theme of being willing to die on the right hill came up very consistently in my interviews as well. So I always love to frame conversations and webinars around some kind of a guiding or driving question, because I'm very much a project-based and student-centered educator. So our question today is, in light of growing resistance to practices we know serve learners, how might we do right by learners in these challenging times? And I'm going to give a few minutes for some reflection. I want to encourage you to write a little something into the chat based on what your own thinking and experience has been. You don't have to necessarily answer all three of these questions, because I'm just going to give you a few minutes. But the questions are, why did you become an educator? If you're a school leader, what drew you into educational administration? And what is your North Star or guiding vision as an educator? So take a couple minutes and please offer your thoughts. I'm just going to sit here and assume that you're doing so. Starting to get some answers. Katrina wrote, my North Star is my students. That's why I teach and love my job. I love that, Katrina. Thank you. And that was something that I actually found myself coming back to a lot in this book, was that if we center learners in the choices that we make, what is it that they need most, that will almost always lead us to the best possible decisions for their well-being. I hope there are more of you writing things. I don't want to jump in too soon. Thank you, Maddie. I will take that compliment. All right, I'm going to go ahead and keep moving forward. Oh, here we go. We got a couple more. Anja, I became a teacher because I had the opportunity to tutor EL college students in China with their writing, English learners, right? And found the process of helping them grow as writers rewarding. Wonderful. Rosa, my North Star is advocating and teaching students social skills. Love that. Maria, I wanted to be the teacher my younger self and kids like me needed. Oh, I love that. I love that. That's very much what I tried to do as well. My North Star is continuing to improve so I can keep being who they need. Oh, beautiful. Thank you for that. Rachel, my North Star is leadership and teacher development, doing everything I can to make sure every student has an effective teacher and principal serving them each and every day. And Monica, just love helping people. I love it. I hope you all will continue to write. There are probably a few people who are still writing some things down. I'm going to go ahead and keep moving. Any of these reflection questions, I certainly encourage particularly the leaders in this session to bring back to your communities, because I think these conversations about what matters to us, they can serve a great deal. And they're incredibly powerful for helping our community stay focused on learners and on what matters. So I want to start by sharing a little bit of the groundwork. When I first started doing the interviews with these leaders, my first question was, what's the great work you're doing in your schools or in your networks that you believe is practices, experiences, initiatives that you believe are absolutely essential for learners, but that are getting some pushback or some kind of a resistance from somewhere. Ultimately, I ended up with two big but core categories. The first one is pedagogical and instructional innovations that prioritize student-centered or learner-centered learning, helping to ensure all students learn and thrive regardless of where they live and attend school. These stories and these initiatives included things like bringing project-based learning into schools, getting learners involved in all levels of governance in a couple of cases, lots and lots of really great experiences with bringing things like student-centered learning to learners with special needs, and just generally what I would describe in big picture form as innovation in education. The second category that came up from the interviews was identity responsive programming, and equity work. This is work that honors place, culture, and learners' full spectrums of identities, perspectives, and needs, ensuring all students see themselves reflected in the curriculum, are supported for who they are, and feel safe and appreciated as individuals. So these experiences, these initiatives were incredibly powerful, actually, to listen to. There were a surprising number and a really gratifying number of schools really coming up with some very important initiatives around inclusion, figuring out how to continue to do diversity, equity, and inclusion work in really challenging times. Just some really extraordinary stories that were shared. So in terms of the resistance that these leaders were experiencing, it was coming from lots of different levels. The first were those internal community constituents, the people who are right there in the building or on the campus, right? So we're talking about teachers, other administrators, and sometimes even learners who were pushing back. I remember working with students in Colombia who would say to me, I just want to be told what the right answer is. Stop asking questions. I don't like it when my teacher doesn't just tell me what the right answer is for the test. So even learners sometimes would push back on things like innovative education because they were so accustomed to a different form. External community constituents, meaning people who are connected to the community but are not on the campus all day, every day. Those would be people like parents or caregivers, donors in the case of private schools, and that's a really tricky one, right? When you're getting resistance from donors, there's a danger of losing donations for those schools that rely on them. That's really tricky. And other types of community partners that work with the school. And then finally, we've got these external groups that have nothing to do with the community. These are folks who will often show up at a public school board meeting and raise a ruckus because they have opinions about education, but they're not part of the community that the decisions are impacting. So these might be legislators, they could be regional and national groups. There are lots of different forms that this takes. So I'm pretty honest about it in the book where those challenges are coming from. So then I want to move a little bit into the strategies that these leaders shared. And I'm basically just going to go topic by topic in terms of the big picture ideas that they shared with me about how they were handling that kind of resistance so that they could really serve learners, do right by learners, right? Do the things that matter most to their well-being and their thriving, and not be held back from things that they knew were good for kids because of that resistance. So Peter Drucker wrote that the greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence itself, it's to act with yesterday's logic. So here's some of today's logic, if you will, that comes from the leaders that I interviewed and from my own experiences as well. The first is all about relationships and trust and what it takes to build a deep sense of connection and understanding across your community. This has everything to do with shared values, with making sure that caregivers and teachers and students trust the school, feel connected to the school and to the vision of the school, and really feel like they are part of the change. I'll get a little deeper into that later when I get into community voice, but really making sure that they trust the school often requires that they have opportunities to share their voices and opinions along the way, right? So that they don't feel like something's happening to them. They feel like it's happening with them and they're part of it. The epigraph for this section comes from Marvin Weisbord, who wrote, "I used to think what's wrong and how can I fix it? Then I realized the right question was what's possible and who cares?" So some of the things that came up in the interviews connected to relationships and trust had to do with some things that I have to admit I'm not sure I was perfect at doing myself as a leader, being quite honest. I learned a lot about myself as a leader in the course of writing this book as well. The first was to seek to understand why community members are resistant. Where is it coming from, right? Don't get angry about it. Just try to understand why they feel the way that they do. Pace was also brought up regularly, consistently, as one of the things that can erode trust, meaning that if we move too quickly, it can erode trust with those people who are resisting or who might resist. And if we move too slowly, we ultimately may end up with a lack of trust from our learners, especially who know that they need something different. And then finally, to the importance of creating intentional structures to support the creation of these relationships. In other words, things like I ran a café con la rectora, like a coffee with the head of school. I ran that once a month. Parents would come together. We would run a project together, right? I would pose a challenge to them, and we would all work together toward a potential solution that was relevant to their lives. That structure helped to build really deep relationships, at the very least, with the folks who showed up for those coffees, and allowed me to have a whole lot more advocates in the room, if you will. The second topic that came up very often was this idea of using varied forms of data to inform the journey. This was actually one of the areas that this chapter took a long time to write. I'm going to admit that. Data means so many different things to different people. And I'll admit that as a humanities kid, right, as somebody who, one of the things that never gets said on my bio is that the first time I ever received a number or letter grade was in university when I was doing my bachelor's degree, because I went to ungraded schools my whole life, right? So the idea of data doesn't always mean the same thing to me as it does to other people. But one of the things that I kept going back to actually did come from my literary background. It came from the work of Vladimir Nabokov, who's one of the authors I just adored and studied a great deal when I was studying creative writing and literature. And it was his ideas about common sense and how dangerous it was to stick to what we believe is common sense. And he wrote that common sense is square, whereas all the most essential visions and values of life are beautifully round as the universe or the eyes of a child at its first circus show. In other words, what he was saying was that what we think of as common sense, this idea of, here's the data we must collect, here's the outcome we must find, that sometimes what that does is causes us to miss the big round eyes, the big moments of awakening, the big excitement, right? The beautifully round vision of the world that happens in the classroom and doesn't get captured always in traditional data. So I found myself trying to find a balance in there. There's definitely some there's some really important information in there from leaders about how you might use quantitative data to inform decisions. There's a really helpful section on turning squishy goals into data points, meaning something squishy, meaning something that would be a little bit challenging to assess, and a process that you can use to help make it more accessible, if you will, or possible to evaluate, so that we don't discount those things that might feel squishy. And what I mean by that are things like empathy, right? Or collaboration within the class, kindness to each other, right? Those kinds of points can be really, really important to the well-being of kids, but it's tricky to turn them into quantitative data. The other thing that I got really excited about were the stories I was hearing from Indigenous educators and leaders about other ways of knowing. In a lot of communities, traditional data is not the way that they know whether they're successful or not. There were some extraordinary stories shared about young people in Indigenous communities, for example, who were gifted the right to sing certain songs by the elders in their community because they had shown that they were capable of doing that well. That's a form of success in a community that often gets ignored when we're only looking at grades and tests and data. So I hope that that section helps all educators, whatever your background, to consider what success looks like, what it means for different students, for different communities, because I really do think in a lot of ways we've sort of narrowed what we mean by that so much that it's really, really challenging for all students to find success. When we open up our thinking about what success looks like, and I know I've got folks in the room who work with the multi-tiered system of supports, when we redefine what we mean by success, it allows us to recognize success in every single child so that we don't have kiddos who are coming home from school feeling like they're failing at everything. The next category is the art of listening. And in this chapter, I was really looking at community voice. I was really curious about how leaders were incorporating student voice, both into forming the initiatives and motivating the change and helping to inspire the community. There were some really great stories about students stepping up and sharing with parents what their experiences had been like in school and why these new initiatives mattered to them. I looked at alumni voice or graduate voice as well, right? Because in a lot of cases, our graduates have the experience of the school and the maturity to be able to express what was challenging, what was effective, what wasn't. I know that in a lot of public districts, we don't tend to track our graduates, but it is a really useful practice. I think they can also be incredible partners for education and for schools. But in terms of their helping to create change, they have a lot to share. Then the other two areas are teachers and caregivers. Teachers, in a lot of ways know better than anybody else in the building what's going on, what learners' experiences are like. Maybe not as well as the students know, but pretty darn close. And bringing in teacher voice, that was actually a really core element in several of the initiatives that were shared with me. And in one case, in the case of Santa Barbara and the detracking of English classes at the high school level in the District of Santa Barbara, California, it was actually teachers who came forward and asked for the detracking because they could see in their own classrooms that they had really gifted kids who were doing no work at all and students who perceived themselves as not good enough to do honors level work, who were perfectly capable of doing honors level work. So by removing the tracking into honors and regular courses, the teachers realized they needed to be teaching better. They needed to be teaching differently so that they could reach every single kid in a mixed group of learners and get rid of the tracking, which was causing, unfortunately, a racial division and a socioeconomic division in the school. So in a lot of cases, teacher voice is very valuable. And finally, the caregiver voice, this I could go on for hours about, right? Caregivers it's kind of a double-edged sword, right? We want parents obviously to be involved It's important that they feel connected to the school where their learners, their children attend, and they can so easily derail the work. And so it's the challenge here. It depends on where you are in your context, whether your caregivers are more supportive or more critical. All it takes are a couple of parents to make a town hall meeting challenging or a school board meeting challenging. But I did find a lot of these leaders said if you involve them early enough in the process of creating a new initiative, if they know that their voices matter early on, they will not resist as much. They'll feel like they have ownership in what was decided and the way that the initiative is working. And so it is important to involve them, and it's important to involve them early. I love Marianne Williamson's statement here. Sorry, I'm tripping on my words a little bit today. In every community, there is work to be done. In every nation, there are wounds to heal. In every heart, there is the power to do it. So I think I actually already gave the summary. My apology. Elevating student voice to confront the resistance, as long as you're keeping your learners safe, involving alumni to help motivate change, leveraging those faculty allies to help to shape the initiatives, and finally involving parents and caregivers as constructively as humanly possible. The next chapter has to do with communication. Communicate with purpose and on purpose. This is very much about language and about the strategies that we're using in our marketing or our communications with our communities. I do speak the language of both the independent school sector or the international school sector because I've worked outside the US, and the public school sector because I'm a product of public education myself. So communication takes different forms in different contexts. I love this quotation from Rumi. It's actually one of my very favorite in the whole book. Raise your words, not your voice. It is rain that grows flowers, not thunder. And in essence, what this chapter looks at is how to keep from turning communications into a battle, and how to make sure that communications are actually about connecting and understanding each other. So the first area came from some really important work around what it takes to create change. And this idea is that we need to try to find ways to connect new initiatives or new work to what makes us who we are, meaning we're not completely changing the school. This move forward, whether it's inclusion or innovation, whatever it might be, this move in a new direction or a better direction is still connected to the identity and ethos of the school. And particularly for community schools with a long history, that's going to matter a great deal. That feeling that we're not just starting over, we're not letting go of years and years of history. We are absolutely moving forward because these initiatives connect to that historical ethos. The language itself came up a lot too. And I'll be honest, as a literature and writing person, I kind of loved these conversations. What are the words that we need to use, right, to describe the work we're doing? Right now, in most contexts around the world, educators, particularly leaders, but at all levels of education, educators are terrified to use the terms diversity, equity, and inclusion, just as an example. And even the word belonging has become a word that's sort of recognized as code for DEI. So what are the words that we need to use to replace those terms? How do we make sure that our language reflects how we're trying to educate in our schools, and frankly, how can a small change in wording change the way people react? One of the best stories I heard came from Michelle Cedrana Pledger at the High Tech High Graduate School for Education, and she shared about a teacher she met who ran a project, a PBL experience with students at her school that she initially entitled the Social Justice Project. In year one, the Social Justice Project got ridiculous amounts of pushback from everyone, basically. And it was largely because it sounded like it was about social justice. The following year, after experiencing all of that pushback, she changed the title of the project, and that was the only thing she changed. It became the Change Makers Project, and she didn't get a single complaint that year. So she hadn't changed anything else about the project, but that one change in wording changed the way that caregivers reacted to the project. So we're talking not about letting go of any of this work, right? We can't, I don't want to see any of us fall prey to this feeling of we just can't do it anymore if we're not allowed to use these words. We just have to change the words, right? Not the work itself. And finally, this last idea comes from Jennifer Abrams' work. She's a communications specialist, and she says that the most important thing is to not get mad and just to be ready, meaning most of the reactions that we get to the work in turbulent times are actually pretty predictable. Sometimes they're not as predictable, obviously, right? But when I think back to my own leadership experience, I think I can pretty safely say most of the reactions that I got from parents about in terms of their fears of project-based learning, most of that was totally predictable. And if I had spent the time with my leadership team to think that through, I wouldn't have been so angry when those things came up. I would have been ready, prepared, and I might even have been able to preempt the negative reactions as well. I'm not going to go too deep into any of the specific wording things that came up, but I did want to mention something that really struck me as important, particularly for those of you who are trying to have these conversations with people who are resistant to the things you're trying to do in your schools. And that is the recognition of how much our language about conflict is, it's just filled with metaphors from war. And it's something, I guess I had been kind of aware of it, but as I was doing the research, it just became incredibly clear that we actually have an awful lot of battle language, if you will, in how we talk about conversations and disagreements. We win or lose an argument. We describe the people who resist as opponents or detractors. We attack their positions and defend our own. We shoot other people's ideas down even. We gain and lose ground. We often refer to the hidden challenges as landmines, and we will die on a hill when we refuse to back down. All of this emerged actually because one leader talked to me about the importance of describing his work as an evolution in education. And the school where I was leading in Colombia used the term revolution in education. And the difference was actually really important. And I sense anyway that in Colombia, a country that's been war-torn for over 5 decades, that to name it as a revolution may actually have set up the mental framing for some of those arguments that I got into with parents and local legislators, because I really did see them as opponents, because we were in a war to change education, whereas evolution suggested a natural organic growth forward or towards something better. So I want to really encourage everyone, all of you who are in education, to think about that, right? To be aware of it. It's really tricky to get rid of all of that language and to get rid of that sort of conflict or war and oriented language when we're doing this work, but doing so can be really valuable. And this is one of my favorite phrases or statements from the book where those ideas came from, Lakoff and Johnson's The Metaphors We Live By. And they wrote, "Imagine a culture where argument is viewed as a dance, the participants are viewed as performers, and the goal is to perform in a balanced and aesthetically pleasing way." I think it's a beautiful image. I will absolutely be striving forward, trying to make sure that that's how I view argument, as opposed to a lockdown, I must win kind of a scenario. I would love to imagine creating that kind of culture within a school community and beyond as well, because the periphery matters, where we see each other as dancers or performers and we are working together on something. The next chapter is all about how we work with our teachers. So from a leadership perspective, this chapter is all about how we prepare our people for the work, whether those are teachers or other people in the community, but particularly our teachers. What does it take to set them up for success? How do we need to protect them when they're doing work that is garnering resistance because we ask them to, right? What do we need to do to make sure that they're safe? And finally, what are the things that we might need to adjust along the way that, in terms of systems that might either lead them to fail or to succeed, right? That might be getting in the way of their success. Coretta Scott King said that the greatness of a community is most accurately measured by the compassionate actions of its members. And that compassion, that willingness to help each other, to protect each other, to make sure everyone's ready, to make sure that the systems are in place to allow things to work the way we want them to. I would describe all of those as compassionate actions that help to make sure our whole community feels good about the work. So this chapter is divided into a few sections. We've got a section on providing that kind of transformative professional learning for teachers that will allow them to change their mindset. Mindset changes are one of the hardest things to do, particularly when it comes to things like student-centered learning. What does it look like to help a teacher stop thinking of themselves as the front of the class and the only expert, and get them asking more questions as opposed to always giving answers? That orientation of the learner knows plenty. The learner should be the protagonist of their own learning experience. That takes a mindset shift. It takes a lot of work and a lot of strategies. And it was really interesting to hear how these different leaders were trying to make sure that the professional learning didn't just happen, but that it really transformed practice and kept it in that new, that it sustained itself over time, that those changes didn't just disappear, right, in a few weeks or a few months or a few years, which is so often the case with professional learning. They also talked a lot about those systems that they needed to adapt, right? What were the things that they needed to shift in their schools to support the innovation and implementation of inclusion efforts and all of those things? So just as an example, in most schools, if you want to do more collaborative learning, you have to adjust your schedule, right? Otherwise, schedule becomes that one thing that keeps the work from moving forward effectively. There are all sorts of, another example would be, teaching what we're now calling durable skills, right? Those things that AI won't be able to do for us, like critical thinking and collaboration. And if we don't value them and how we evaluate, then we're going to have to adapt our evaluation systems to value or to position those things as important within the context and culture of our schools. So what are those systems that are creating potential roadblocks to the work that you're trying to do? And how might some small adaptations allow you to remove a few of those obstacles for your teachers? And finally, protecting teachers, protecting your people when the opposition arises. I don't think there's anything more important in this whole book. And I unfortunately heard some hard stories from teachers, especially, who felt that they had not been protected, felt that their leaders didn't even really understand their day-to-day experience and how hard it was, who had experiences with parents coming at them or were asked to come speak at a school board meeting, and the reaction was really challenging. Lots and lots of different kinds of experiences, right, with feeling unprotected. And when people feel threatened, I mean, Margaret Wheatley put it beautifully, and it's in my last chapter, when people feel threatened, it's very hard for them to move forward and think and function well. And so really protecting your people, making sure your teachers know you have their back. When something happens, before something happens, you're out there making sure that they are not going to have they're not going to be under attack, or if they are, you're sort of standing there as the bodyguard to protect them from those attacks. You'd be surprised how much even small gestures can matter. And there's actually a story from my own experience of when I was a teacher I had a conversation with a parent who had called me to scream at me because his child was not turning her work in. I was her advisor. And according to the parent, it was my fault that his daughter was not turning her work in. And he screamed at me on the phone. And I have some pretty significant PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. And I really froze on the phone with him. He screamed at me for a good 10 minutes. I couldn't even make myself hang up. I went straight to my leader and I said, listen, we're going to have a meeting about this student tomorrow, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to function unless I know that you are providing me with some protection. Right? If you're in the room and I know that you've got my back, I'm going to be able to handle this meeting. But if he goes off the wall again and I don't feel that way, I'm either going to completely freeze or I'm going to leave the meeting. And either way, it's not going to be good for the student, right? For the learner. The very next day when we had this meeting, not only did she protect me, but she actually moved from the seat that she initially chose to position herself physically between me and the father. It was the most subtle of moves. He would never have figured out that that was what she was doing. And it made a world of difference for me as a teacher, because I knew that I was under protection, right? That this guy couldn't just come at me. And that physical barrier, frankly, helped more than you would think, right? So how do we protect our people? How do we make sure they know that we will always take the heat, and that we'll always assume that they're doing the best they can and support the work that they're doing too? The very last chapter of the book is Lead with Humility, Courage, and Hope. And this chapter is made up mostly of things that leaders shared based on my last question, which was, what's some other advice that you would offer to leaders who are struggling with resistance, who are facing polarization in their communities and are being challenged by it? And I got some pretty great answers. This last chapter also opens with Angela Davis's words. You have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time. What was very clear to me from all of the leaders and from my own experience as well is that it's not something you do for a day and stop doing. It's something that you have to do every single day. If the culture of your school needs those initiatives, the innovations, the inclusion efforts, the equity focus, we have to hold on to it, right? And we have to make it a priority every single day. Their advice was varied, and my own final advice was, we've got to send our kids, right? We always should be starting and ending with what is good for learners. What do our learners need? How does this benefit learners? But the kind of advice that came from the interviews, remember that you're not an island. You don't have to do this work alone. Build networks, find consultants, connect with organizations and cooperatives that can help to support the work you're doing. Help your teachers to connect with each other around things that they're passionate about. And for you, those of you who are leaders, find your people too, right? Figure out how to connect with other leaders, join some conferences, make some connections. One of my favorite pieces of advice came from my own mentor, Arnie Langberg. And what he said was, read and then contact the people whose work you love, right? You don't even have to go to conferences. You just read great stuff. And when you really love something an author has done, you reach out and you find out if they're running courses, and you connect with other leaders who are interested in the things that they're trying to do, so that you're not doing it alone. A lot of these leaders described leadership as a very lonely process or experience, and that it's made significantly better and easier when we know that we're doing it with support and with a group of friends. They also stressed this idea that leadership is a journey. It's not something that we finish in a week, right? It's not something that there's never that moment, at least in my own experience, and this is what the leaders I spoke to said as well. There's never that moment where you can even say, we're finished, we succeeded, right? Because leadership and education are a journey. It goes on and on and on, and we will hit ripples again even after we thought we had something solved, and we'll have these great successes right in the middle of the most difficult and dark moments. Right? So recognizing that it's a marathon and not a sprint, slowing down a little bit, taking care of ourselves along the way, making sure that we're okay, that our teachers are okay. All of that is part of the journey. And finally, this idea that hope is an action, is a verb. This comes from, to some degree, from the work of the book called Active Hope, and also from my own experience. I actually have come to believe that hope and optimism even are radical positions to take right now, and maybe always. That there is this idea of action is really the core to both of them, right? We're not talking about hope in the sense of I'm going to dream and pretend the world is better than it is and dream of something better. We're talking about hope in the form of an action, of the things that we will do to make sure that that we can live that hope, that we can, within our communities, really move forward with a sense of hope and optimism, and do the best we can every step along the way. This also connects to this idea of planting seeds, because given that it's a journey, and given that we will do everything we possibly can in the time that we have, we may or may not actually see the fruit of the work we do. I certainly know that's the case for me. I left my headship in a bad situation. I know that I don't think that I will go back necessarily to leadership, but I very much want to support other leaders. But when I left Gimnasio Los Caobos and left Colombia in the middle of the pandemic, what I hoped was very simply that the seeds I had planted would in fact bear fruit. And I love this Indian proverb that says that blessed are those who plant trees under whose shade they will never sit. So some of the things that we're working toward, some of the things we're striving toward right now as educators, we may not see them come to full fruition, but we still have to plant the seeds. We have to do the best we can in the time we have with the resources we have to make sure that learners get the benefit of the best we can do. And I really do, again, I'm going to keep coming back to learners. And I love that a couple of you mentioned that in your North Star, right? That what matters most is to plant the seeds that will benefit kids, will benefit children and teenagers, young people of all ages, and even if we don't see it all the way to the end, we're still doing something really important. And I will say, I've been back to Caobos. I'm still on the board of that school, and the seeds I planted are bearing fruit. And it's exciting to be able to look at it and see that that's true. So I'm going to encourage just one moment more on the chat, and then I'll turn things back over to Melissa. Commitment is what it's all about. I hope that this has been a meaningful conversation. And of course, please stick around for the giveaway. But I want to invite all of you to take a moment now. And of course, we'll do some questions too. I'm glad to take questions. But I'd love for each of you to make a commitment. What's something that you want to do in the next week, 2 weeks, month, 2 months, that will help to transform these ideas into action in your own communities? And I'll give you a moment to think about that and encourage you to write a commitment into the chat. And it doesn't have to be huge. It can be something small, because trust me, small efforts make all the difference to the people that they impact. I feel like I need some kind of Jeopardy background music when people are writing. You can keep them short and simple, but I'd love to hear what's something that you would like to commit to doing a little differently moving forward. Look, oh, there we go. Katrina, be a better listener all around. Oh, yes. Yes. I think that's one of my big challenges as well. What does it look like to listen better? And one of the leaders said, you've got to lean in with curiosity. And I was like, oh gosh, I'm not sure I do that when people disagree with me. So yeah, being a better listener, that's great. Give you another moment here. I don't want to take away time from questions. Rosa writes, I would like to provide opportunities for staff to make connections with students during school. For example, a friendly competition or game, that allows them to feel connected, like they've got a real, not just teacher-student relationship, but a real deep connection, right? Anja writes, I want to work to incorporate my students' culture and identity into their projects in meaningful ways. I love that. And I'll tell you, my second book is actually about that, though it's not with Corwin. Check out The Landscape Model of Learning, all about connecting the work that they're doing in school to their identities. Rachel writes, commit to follow through with 2 big current initiatives, focus standards and visible learning. Very nice to help our schools start to transform to more student-centric learning environments. Love that. That's really great. Seta, make sure I touch base with each student at least once a week. Yeah, that's really important. I mean, we can read a lot from just looking at them and their behavior and their body language and all of that, but really touching base with them. I used to do that a lot through a journal so that I wasn't necessarily sitting down with them individually, but the journal became a place that they could communicate with me. Maria writes, I'm working on patience overall. We'll always need to return to this goal. So now would be a good time to refocus on that. Absolutely. And because frankly, losing your patience doesn't do anybody any good, right? All right. Well, this was wonderful. I'm super grateful to all of you. I will put this slide up just for a moment as Melissa gets her slides ready. She's going to overtake my sharing here in a moment. And I'm glad to respond to questions. That QR code will take you to my LinkedIn profile. I encourage you to connect with me, to follow me, and I will certainly be posting about other opportunities to engage with the content in the book in the coming months. We'll be doing a big launch event with lots and lots of the interviewees who participated on November 18th. Keep an eye out for my posts about it. And I will go ahead then and Melissa, I'm assuming you want me to close my slides, but I'm glad to take any questions if folks have questions. And then I know you have some announcements that you need to make. So I will go ahead and stop sharing.
Okay. Well, thank you to Jennifer for her presentation today. And I wish everybody a good day, good night, morning, wherever you are in the world. And we will see you next time. Have a great week, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.